So it's my great honor to introduce Dr. Craig Harper from the University of Tennessee, who's going to be talking about fire effects on wildlife. I've mentioned just the wonderful resources that we have with research, and Craig is the rock star of that. So thank you, Craig.
Well, thank you very much, Eric. It's great to be here with everybody. Not a long drive down to North Georgia, 2 or 3 hours, and we're all in the same region. I'm very happy and excited to be here and talk to you about woodland management, woodland restoration. I work with a lot of things, especially applied management oriented, whether it be forest management, food plots and agricultural applications, managing early successional communities and specific effects of disturbances, whether that be mechanical or herbicides, fire, etc. But this is one of my favorite things that we do. And we have worked with different forest systems, and in this woodland restoration theme now for at least 20 plus years. Am I supposed to be standing somewhere else?
Raise up your hand like you're giving pleasant leave.
Hello, hello. Is that good? So anyway, it's been very exciting, and we've looked at effects and implications for a lot of different species, and we've done this in pine systems and in hardwood systems, but today I'm going to concentrate on hardwoods. Well, I'll throw in some short leaf restoration as well, but everything that I'm going to talk about, the different research projects, experiments, etc., pictures, whatnot, they all come from this region, whether it be the Cumberland Plateau, the Ridge and Valley, the Southern Appalachians, or the Piedmont, either in Tennessee, the Carolinas, or Georgia. So I kept it to this region. I thought that would be appropriate and of interest to this crowd. And I tried to include as much as I could with the different projects and experiments that we've done here recently. So let's get into it, and I'll be here through the break. If y'all have any questions or want to discuss anything, of course, I'm happy to do so. Mike mentioned that, of course, there'd be a wide variety of people here from different backgrounds and different agencies, and including private landowners, many of whom are just getting used to implementing fire. Some of them haven't yet, but they have interest in it. So I'm trying to include some information for those who might not have had as much fire experience. And then, of course, I know many of you have tremendous fire experience, and I hope maybe there'll be a little something in here that you'll be able to glean of interest as well. But first, I thought I would try to put this topic of woodland restoration into perspective with forest management. You know, I think we can all agree that if we boil it down to be as simple as possible, there's like 3 things that we would do with forest. 1, we can regenerate the forest to start a stand anew, and there's different systems and methods that we use to do that. 2, we can improve the forest, and that may be for lots of different objectives. And then 3, we could clear the forest. And I don't mean clear cut, which is a regeneration method, but to clear it to establish additional early successional vegetation. So there's 3 broad areas that we might look at as to what could be done. And then if we bring those into perspective with regard to forestry and wildlife objectives, I think we could easily agree that regenerating the stand is clearly a forestry objective. And if we improve the stand, that might be a forestry or wildlife objective. And of course, there's lots of different practices that can be used to improve a stand. And then if we clear the stand, at least within forestry and wildlife, that's going to be a wildlife objective, because obviously you wouldn't have a forest there anymore. So in the context of this, what I'm going to look at and concentrate on is improving the stand, but doing so with a view towards woodland restoration. So what is a woodland? You know, terminology is very important, and it's easy to become confused if we don't use terminology accurate and with some consistency. So a lot of times we might call just any woods a woodland. But when you look into the ecology literature, you can see that there's a gradient, and we're all familiar with prairies out in the Midwest. And a savanna then is in an area that would have a little more rainfall than you would find in the Great Plains, for example. And you would generally have tree covering around 5 to 30% of the area. And so that's termed a savanna. And then once we get into about 25 or 30% tree cover and go up to about 70 to 80% tree cover, that's termed a woodland. But if the area has an understory that is largely dominated by herbaceous species, otherwise we simply have a thinned forest stand and we have woody species regenerating underneath. And then, of course, we go into a forest condition that is leading into closed canopy. And so if we look at some pictures along this gradient, here's a picture of what we would commonly see and call a grassland in the eastern United States with a little to no tree cover. We have a few trees coming into the site. Of course, this is short leaf, naturally occurring short leaf on this site. This would be more of a savanna structure. And then we have more trees into that 30 to 80% coverage. And that's a wide zone. And there's differences in there that I'll try to get at here in a little while. And this is shortleaf, another shortleaf woodland restoration site. So this is more indicative of a woodland structure. The same thing can be true for hardwoods. Here we have an oak savanna, an oak woodland with about 70% tree cover. And then here's that condition that I talked about where we've thinned some trees, we've disturbed the canopy, we've allowed about 30% sunlight to come into the stand, but we're not using fire frequently enough, maybe every 3 to 5 years, and you don't see an understory that is dominated by herbaceous plants. It's primarily woody plants, whether it be shrubs, trees, vines, and of course brambles, etc. So this would be indicative of a thinned stand. And then of course we go into a closed canopy hardwood stand that is ubiquitous in areas that are not managed by canopy disturbance or with fire. So if we think about what is available to wildlife in all of these different conditions, we can see that a closed canopy stand provides very good habitat conditions for a number of species. And so a closed canopy stand is very good for species such as red-eyed vireos, ovenbirds, gray squirrels, etc. There's nothing wrong with this. There's nothing right about this. That's just the way it is. When we start implementing some canopy disturbance and we allow a little more growth and structure into the understory, we start seeing other species coming into the stand that might not be found in a closed canopy stand, or they might not have all of the resources in a closed canopy stand that they would in a stand that is receiving more sunlight, such as this. And there's many other species, but I'm just trying to provide some examples of those that we would be found in these conditions. So here's a stand where the canopy has been disturbed to allow about 50% sunlight coming in. This would be indicative, for example, of a shelterwood harvest that you've taken about half of the canopy out and providing about half shade for regeneration of species underneath. And in this situation, there's going to be other species, wildlife species, that are perfectly suited and happy in these conditions. Now, here's a shelterwood harvest, a two-age shelterwood harvest where the overwood is not going to be removed. And so the amount of sunlight typically is somewhere in the neighborhood of 50 to 60% coming to this area, and the growth underneath is rapid. So within 1 to 2 growing seasons following the removal of about half of the overwood, this is the type of structure that we see. And this is very good for lots of different species that would require a little more openness in the canopy and the structure underneath. Now, what does this all have to do with woodlands? So here we have a two-age shelterwood. We're going to retain the overwood, but we don't allow the regeneration to come up underneath to continue to grow. We're setting that back with prescribed fire. So we have introduced prescribed fire now following this two-age shelterwood. And in this situation, this stand was harvested commercially by logging, not just by removing the trees by hand, and I'll get to that in a little bit. But by doing so with this and maintaining relatively frequent fire, we can then create what would be a woodland condition. And then there's lots of other species that would come in and enjoy that type of condition. So I know lots of people are involved in trying to restore woodland, some relatively small scale on private landowners' property, some relatively large scale on state and federal properties. But one of the first things that we do when we're determining if we're going to try and restore a woodland on a site is think about the site. And of course, we're talking about using frequent fire. So ecologically speaking, it's best to look at those sites that are relatively dry. Those, you know, in our region here with some topography, we're talking about slopes that are south and west facing that are relatively dry, and we can continue to burn those. And on those north and east facing sites that are less likely to burn ecologically and historically, yes, fire can feather into those, or some landowners might choose to keep fire out of those to benefit those species that would meet their habitat conditions in a closed canopy stand. So I think it's really neat in that with the topography, we can have an extremely diverse landscape with regard to removing a certain amount of the canopy and interjecting fire and maintaining that community on a different fire regime. And right up here is just a little clip of a topo map, you know, through Google Earth. And here off of this main ridge, we've just selected these side ridges. And I will do this with for landowners as well as, for example, with the Tennessee Division of Forestry. Okay, we're wanting to diversify a property. And so it's all forested. And one perfect way of doing that is to choose these sites that are ecologically suited to burning and implementing more canopy disturbance on those sites and then introducing frequent fire. And so we literally can go in and hop from one ridge to the next in the same day and burn several of these and do so in a mosaic. Maybe not burn them all in one day, but definitely all in 1 year at different times, which I'll get to here in just a second. Of course, for large-scale work, it would be more efficient to be able to harvest trees in this canopy removal, but a lot of times, especially with private landowners, the trees might not pay their way out of the woods. The amount of area is not enough to entice a logger, and so we're talking about smaller scale work. And so with smaller scale work, that can be done by selectively either felling or killing the trees that you don't like, various species, or reducing the stems of desirable trees if they're too dense to allow a certain amount of sunlight into the stand. And of course, I enjoy doing this because it's like a very precise prescription. You can go in and you know, like surgically remove specific trees and enable a precise amount of sunlight into a stand. And then you're changing the composition of the stand strictly to what you want, as opposed to, and what oftentimes is done, especially on large acreages, on public land tracts, you might just introduce fire without having a canopy disturbance. And then you're relying on the fire, especially the fire intensity, being great enough in places to thin out the trees and low enough in places to not injure or harm the trees. Most private landowners, however, do not favor this. That would be done on larger scale, but not in smaller scale where you would want to have much more control over fire intensity. And so if that's what you're doing only using fire, then the fire is more often indiscriminately killing various trees, whether they be desirable species or undesirable species, primarily based on the site and the litter conditions, winds, et cetera, that might be hotter around certain trees and not around others. But in this example, we're specifically taking out those that we don't want and leaving those that we do want. And the application that I'm referring to, whether it's hack and squirt or whether it's girdle and spray, is very effective and precise, as I mentioned. So here, you know, we might girdle one stem off of a double stem tree, such as this yellow poplar, and kill that one and leave the other. Whereas here, this example of a double trunk sweet gum, so we girdle around the bottom of the split, and then we can kill the entire tree with just one girdle. And so this is what we're left with. And I would argue, well, I won't argue, I can state from the literature that there is no one other component in a stand that would lead to increased wildlife species richness than the presence of standing and down dead wood. There are so many species that are tied to this. And so having these trees remaining as snags can be very important for those who are wanting to increase various non-game species and many of them that are declining. And even if it's not rare species, you're definitely going to see increased species richness on a property when you have more downed and standing dead wood. Now, at the same time as this light is introduced, the crowns of these remaining trees, the ones that are retained, are growing larger. And so what we have found that just in the first year after complete releasing some of these trees, we're seeing a 25% increase in the crown size just in 1 year. And that's significant. Now, it's not going to continue to increase by 25% every year, but think about what we've just done. We've just taken out species that weren't desirable for a particular objective, and let's pick, whether it be oaks or other mass-producing species. We've taken out those that are not desirable, left those that are desirable, and now we're seeing an increase in crown size such that we are producing more mast and at the same time allowing better development of the understory through the sunlight that is coming in. And through a 10-year project, we determined that by doing so, within 5 years, on average, we have increased the mass production of these trees that have been retained by 65%. So what that means is you could go into a stand that is solid oaks, and if you knew which of those individual trees are the primary mass producers, and what we've determined is about 40% of the trees produce at least 70% of the mast. You could go in and remove half of the trees and increase acorn production. Now that's about the best example of having your cake and eating it too that I can think of. We could take out half of the desirable trees if we are able to identify those that are the poor and moderate producers, and leave the ones that are the good producers, and we're going to increase mass production, and at the same time, we're going to increase forage production and soft mast and cover, et cetera, in the understory. So that's an important consideration. So when we're doing this woodland restoration, of course, we're trying to retain relatively fire-tolerant species and relatively high wildlife value species, but we'll also retain some of those that are not exactly fire-tolerant. Knowing when we use very low intensity fire, we can maintain some of these species that are not really fire tolerant in that stand for whether it be soft mast or hard mast, what have you. And I'm not a hater of any, tree species. Well, there probably are some non-native tree species I really don't like. But, any of these will provide something for some wildlife species. So don't take me wrong that I'm saying, oh, kill all of these trees in every situation. I'm just saying that on average, these would be the species that we would select against versus those that I mentioned in the previous slide. So I don't think I have to stand up here and explain to this group that we can use fire in hardwoods, but I'm going to anyway, because I do continue to get questions from people asking about using fire in hardwoods, and it's much less likely here than when I go just up into Kentucky, and especially to West Virginia and Ohio and Michigan and Pennsylvania, where there is still huge reluctance to use fire in hardwoods. However, yes, we can use fire in hardwoods, and we can do so safely without killing and injuring the trees, and we can do so at different times of the year. But what has to be paid close attention to, of course, is the intensity of the fire, because as we all know, we can burn any pine stand with a certain intensity of fire. But also another caveat in the hardwood stands is the litter, especially the large debris that is around the bottoms of the trees. And so if we have debris such as this at the bottom of the trees, even with low intensity fire, we're apt to injure the trees, as you can see here, with a cat face that, of course, provides a place for injury to come in, for fungus, etc., and degrade the tree. And so as we're going through stands that we're burning, and when I say we, it's myself, graduate students, technicians, landowners we're working with, and of course I work a lot with state agencies on various WMAs and state forests. But if you're burning 500 acres, I fully realize you can't go through and pay attention to the debris that's at the bottom of every tree. But especially when you're working on a discrete management unit on a state forest or WMA that is not that large, or if you're working with private landowners, we walk through the stand. And when we see debris like this, we simply move it out of the way, out from close proximity of the stem, and then we're able to retain these trees for long term without injury or killing them. Something else that I stress to private landowners, especially those who haven't burned before or do not have much burn experience, is to start small. You don't have to burn 80 acres, much less 800 acres. They don't have 800 acres. Usually they'll have somewhere in the neighborhood of 80 to 200 acres for the average landowner. And they might want to burn, one wood lot, and they're hesitant to do so, which is good. It's healthy to be hesitant to do things like this. It also should be hesitant to get in the car and go down I-75 through Atlanta. But, we got to do things, with care. And so I talked to them about just simply blowing out fire breaks with a backpack blower. And let's be honest, most of the people doing this, and you'll see here in a minute, I'm going to concentrate a lot on deer and turkeys. And I concentrate a lot on deer and turkeys because the lion's share of private landowners who are managing their property are doing so for something they can shoot. It's nothing to be ashamed of or apologize about. It's just a fact. And so if we can work with those who are wanting to manage their property for deer and turkeys, and let's be honest, bigger deer and more gobblers, that's what it's about, and they can use fire to help them, and they're not sure how much to burn, etc., and they haven't burned much before, I ask them, okay, do you plant food plots? The vast majority of them do. What's the smallest food plot that you ever killed a deer on? Oh, half acre, quarter acre. Well, why don't you blow a half acre or a quarter acre out here in your woods and learn how to use fire on this? Start small. And you can do so during seasons when fire intensity is much less than it is in March and April and February, those months where most of the wildfire occurred that we just saw from the previous speaker's presentation. So by implementing some of these fires in summer, whether midsummer, late summer, other times when intensity on average is much lower, it's much safer for them. And doing so with experienced personnel, putting your arm around them and helping along in this process. And then it gets more and more, and as they expand, and they then begin to reduce canopy coverage and get into more of a woodland situation, all of a sudden they're managing for species that they don't even know about, they can't identify, to be honest, they don't care about, but we can work with them to manage more acres for non-game species for those who are interested in deer or turkeys than if we worked only or tried to concentrate on working with those landowners who are specifically interested in non-game species. I've been in my job as Extension Wildlife Specialist for 26 years. On less than 5 fingers, I can count the number of calls of people who have asked me about managing for forest songbirds or for butterflies or for anything like that. So to get off of this, we're using low intensity fire. Fire breaks can be implemented in different ways, and we're altering our timing to burn during different seasons of the year. This is what our fires typically look like. Low intensity, 4 to 6 inch flame lengths, primarily using back and fire unless necessary to get the fire to move. All I'm interested in most of these situations is consuming the leaf litter and at least top killing those small stems to keep this in a structure that is desirable for the species I'm managing for, and also to continue promoting increased forage that I'll get to in just a second. Now, as you can see, and we've done this over many years, looking at average temperature, whether by these tiles that we paint with temperature paint, as well as hobo loggers. There's a thermocoupler in here and a little probe down here at the end of this pipe. We enclose it in metal with insulation to protect the logger, and so the data logger. And so you can see how the average maximum temperature during early growing season burning, and this would be April and May, is on average greater than the maximum temperature during late growing season burning, and that would be August through October. And so this difference right here will have a very real and meaningful effect, differential effect on the vegetation that I'll show you in just a little while. And so here's the result after burning many of these stands. As you can see here, these trees are not being damaged, they're not being killed, and we're simply setting back the vegetation that is in the understory and allowing for fresh vegetation to germinate and grow. And it doesn't only have to be done on south or west facing slopes. We burn in other sites as well. Here's one that's a north facing oak, hickory, poplar stand. There's lots of black cherry in here. There's lots of flowering dogwood remaining in here, but there's a stand that's been burned 6 times in 13 years on, a little more than a 2-year fire return interval. And think about it. For many landowners, that's pretty. It looks good. They can see. It's not, dense and whatever and like snaky, although there will be snakes in this, but a lot of people don't realize that. They just see this vegetation, it's pretty, and all of a sudden they're doing things for wildlife species that they're really not aware of. I've done a lot of burning with state and federal agencies, and this was an example of several years ago where we're burning an experimental site, and I'm not so pleased with this, guys. This is too hot. Oh, it's all right. It's gotten to be about 3 o'clock. We'll go ahead and ring it because we got to go to the house. Well, that's not going to do any favors on these trees right here. And so when you're seeing that type of signature right there, I can guarantee you're scorching some trees. And this is where you see a lot of the damage, a lot of the injury taking place, because this looks like a low intensity fire if you've been used to burning in pine systems. But when you move into hardwood systems, this is too hot. This is going to damage some trees. So with I'm going to talk a little bit about frequency and then into season. And it is striking at how often, how frequently we need to burn to maintain these systems. So if we burn with a 1 to 2 year fire return interval, this is the type of structure that we can expect to maintain that herbaceous, an understory that has at least 50% or so herbaceous species. And that's going to be beneficial for lots of different species that like a more open canopy structure and a developed understory. Now, if we back that off to a 4-year fire return interval, this is the average structure that we're going to see, especially when we have 30 to 50% sunlight coming into the stand. It would be even more than this if we had greater than 50% sunlight coming into the stand. And there again, this is going to be beneficial to other wildlife species that require that more developed woody structure in the understory. If we hold off to 8 years, which is applicable for some species and in some situations, this is the amount of tree growth that we can expect to take place underneath a stand that is receiving somewhere in the neighborhood of 30 to 40% sunlight. And then that's going to be good for different species. And so, for example, in North Georgia, I know many people are concentrating and interested on rough grouse. Prescribed fire certainly can be used to help enhance habitat for rough grouse, needing relatively dense stems, especially below 3 inches or so in diameter, and also for for woodcock and other non-game species as well. Just skip ahead a little bit for the seasonality stuff. I didn't include slides specific to ruffed grouse, but that's one species that you would want to concentrate your burning during the dormant season, because if you expand that, and especially if you're doing large scale burning in North Georgia and you're trying to help ruffed grouse, they do not have propensity to re-nest. And so if you disturb their initial nest, they're more than likely done nesting for that year. So that's one species that it would be better to not try and burn, especially large scale burning where you're trying to manage for ruffed grouse into the nesting season. So woodland restoration requires very, very frequent fire. And here's an example of a site that has been burned pretty much annually for 20 years. And burned during the dormant season. And so you will notice a couple of things. You'll notice a lack of woody stems, and you'll also notice a dominance of grass, particularly native warm season grass. In this situation, it's primarily broom sedge and little blue stem. And that is a very, very real expectation if you chronically use dormant season or early growing season fire routinely and very frequently. You're going to see that you're going to drive that ground cover composition towards warm season grass. And I'll show you some different pictures here in just a little while. Whereas if you're using more fire later in the growing season and into late summer, for example, you will have reduced coverage of warm season grass. You will typically have increased coverage of forbs and increased coverage of native cool season grasses, such as the needle grasses and poverty grasses and a few others, which has a very different structure than some of the native warm season grasses. Very interesting, and I'm going to show you more data from this site right here. This is at the prescribed fire demonstration area just west of Cookville on the Cumberland Plateau. Ground cover represented by tree sprouts. The red line is on a 1-year fire return interval, blue line on a 2-year fire return interval, green line on a 3-year fire return interval. Look at the increase in tree sprout coverage by just going from a 1 to a 3-year fire return interval. Now, you can keep that knocked back with a fire return interval of 3 years, but the compositional change is going to be very different if you go from 1 year to 2 years to 3 years. And the notion that we can maintain these systems with a 3 to 5 year fire return interval, it's not going to happen. I'm not aware of any site where you're going to maintain herbaceous dominated plant communities with the ground cover with burning that infrequently. So what's the effect on the tree sprouts with regard to your timing of burning? The effects of burning during different seasons is something that I'm most interested in, and we've looked at this over a long period of time and in different seasons, and I'll show you some of the results here. Now, this was a relatively small data set. We collected this a few years ago, and you see different tree species burned during the early portion of the growing season or the late portion of the growing season. In this example, what you see is the vast majority of them resprout regardless. No difference with regard to season of burning. And here's what we're talking about. Of course, the fire was hot enough to top kill the stem, but the species resprouts after being top killed the following growing season, as opposed to not. And so there's a very real difference between killing a tree species and top killing it. If you're top killing it, it's there, the reserves in the root system still there, and it's going to pop back out when conditions permit. Now, that differs from some other data, and I think I shared this with you last time I was with you, but I wanted to remind and perhaps show to some folks who didn't see. Here's the effect of burning in September versus burning in March, dormant season burning versus growing season burning on resprouting woody cover. And so this was in old field situation, but we can still think about this in a woodland scenario. Right here is an old field situation. This complex was covered by sweet gum, red maple, and green ash. And so we didn't implement any treatment here. Here's the treatment where we implemented triclopyr, Garlon 3A, as a foliar application the season after. Here is the March burn, the season after. Obviously, we had a good burn, top killed everything, but you see the amount of trees that are resprouting and coming back in. Here's the September burn, much fewer trees, a lot of legumes, and that was reflected in the plant response later, where we had greater than 50% cover with legumes, herbaceous species following the September burn, as opposed to the dormant season fire. And those results are fairly common, where we may see greater forb response by burning later into the growing season as opposed to dormant or early growing season. And so here's a picture of the map of the prescribed fire demonstration area, Bridgestone Firestone WMA. And so what we have here, we started this back in 2011. And so we have units that are burned in April, and we have units that are burned in September, October. And we have units of each that are burned every year, every 2 years, and every 3 years. And then we have a woodland situation right down here, where when we burn the woodland, we will pull how many years in which season out of the hat at random, and then we'll apply that in that unit. This has been really neat, and I'll show you a couple pictures. If I stand on the fire break right here, between the unit that is burned every 2 years during the late portion of the growing season versus every 2 years during the early portion of the growing season, and I look to the south into the early growing season unit, this is what I see. If I turn 180 degrees and look into the late growing season burn treatment, this is what I see. And so even, from the picture, you see more forbs over here, but you also see a few more tree sprouts coming up, and that's related to the intensity. When you're trying to burn these areas right here and you still have green, solid green vegetation in September and early October, that fire intensity is so low that many of these are not top killed with every fire. And so it's not uncommon at all to see some more woody species coming into these areas, whereas over here, the conditions are going to be drier with less green during the early portion of the growing season, and that leads to more warm season grass. So here I am on the fire break. If I look to the right, you can see the early growing season unit, to the left, the late growing season unit. And this is a more recent picture into the early and into the late. And you can see consistently, whether it's on the 1 year, 2 year, or fire return, 3 year fire return interval, we're seeing greater vegetation species richness following the late growing season fires as opposed to the early growing season fires. And then if we look here at the percentage of forb coverage, very interesting. If we're wanting increased forb coverage in the 1 and 2 years, we're increasing forb coverage. If we wait to 3 years, that forb coverage over time, and that's from 2011 until 2023, is going down, primarily because of the increased coverage of trees in the 3 year fire return unit that are getting larger, casting more shade, and not enabling to keep as much forb coverage. So here I'm on a fire break. This is looking into the 2 year fire return interval every in April, and here's the early growing season unit every 3 years. So right there you can see is the difference between a 2 year fire return interval and a 3 year. It makes a big difference with regard to the regrowth of the woody species. So with regard to woodland restoration, and that is what we're looking at right here. This was a loblolly pine stand that was cut in 1997 and then purchased by the Tennessee Wildlife Resources Agency. And since, nothing has been done with it except for occasional fire until we started the prescribed fire demonstration area. So what we're doing is developing a woodland situation here, but looking at the effect of timing of fire and frequency of fire. And you're seeing that if you're wanting to establish a woodland, waiting 3 years to burn, you're going to be very frustrated to get there. It's going to require more frequent fire than that. Now, hopefully, and I was very happy to hear the previous speaker talk about burning all through the year. Certainly every day should be considered a potential burn day according to what your objectives are. Here we are burning in August of 22, here in October of 22 in a woodland situation, and a very interesting paper here showing the average number of burn days across the year in our region, about 90. And let's enjoy this, burning at different times of the year, not making this an event, oh, we got to hurry up and get this done, but enjoying the being out there and seeing the work that the fire can do on the landscape. Here's an example of a restored woodland. This is on one of the WMAs in East Tennessee. We're influencing the structure by manipulating the amount of sunlight that comes into the stand. And then we're manipulating the composition of what's growing up underneath with our frequency of disturbance. And this is very important for species such as wild turkey. Of course, wild turkey nest can enjoy greater success with better structure and cover when that's available to them, as opposed to not, that you might find in closed canopy woods, for example. And the forage that is available for deer, and the landowners love to see this. This is very enlightening to them. And this will directly reduce the amount of food plots that they think they need to plant in order to meet nutritional requirements for deer. But you can see here the pounds per acre and the nutritional carrying capacity met by a certain constraint of crude protein or phosphorus in the diet at what an open woodland will provide, pounds per acre or deer days per acre, as opposed to closed canopy forest. So just by doing this right here on many properties, we have seen an average increase of 10 pounds in body weight per sex and age class, and in some cases 30 pounds increase, especially among adult does and adult males, after implementing such practices. And this makes a difference in where they can take their adult doe weights, because usually they're killing more does than bucks, of course, and then they can model this to look at the percent increase in mature buck growth score. And so it shouldn't be revelational, by having a larger frame, larger body size, the deer then are able to produce larger antlers. And so showing results like this can be very informative to the landowners and getting them to implement more of this type management that will benefit other species as well. Marcus Lashley at the University of Florida, he was at Mississippi State when they put this together. This is another image that's very interesting. Here is the depiction of feeding photos by deer. Look at the black line with no fire. How that peaks in spring with spring green up. And then if we burn in March and you follow the blue line, how the feeding photos, the deer feeding in a particular area, is extended, because you've just set back the vegetation a little bit. Now you have some fresh sprouting vegetation a little later, and how that lingers into the summer. Now, if we burn in June, now we have fresh sprouting vegetation coming up later in the summer, and look at the feeding photos that we have here, and cumulatively, you look at the total number of feeding photos with no fire, March fire, June fire. All of a sudden, we see how extending our burning throughout the growing season is very beneficial for deer, and not just to do all of our burning in March or all of our burning in June, but to do both on the same property, and to scale back some of your management such that you're not burning entire stands, but you're splitting your burning up, such as you're burning, half or a third during one time of the year, and then also during other times of the year. So here we are burning during the summertime, setting back the understory, and look at the nutritional value of the forage that's available. The top graph shows crude protein, and the dark bars are control with no fire. And you see how crude protein is relatively low, and it goes down and wanes through the summertime. Whereas if you burn in March, you're going to have increased crude protein through the summer. Then if you burn in June, look at that bump in July. And the same effect is with phosphorus, these being two critical nutrients that are needed for antler growth and body condition in general. So by extending our burning, we're providing more deer forage, and we're providing increased nutrition in the deer forage as well. And in another project where we looked at the effect of burning during the early growing season in orange versus late growing season in gray, as you can see here, the amount of deer use following the timing of fire is, of course, increased in So turkey use is more related to the structure during the growing season because we're primarily talking about hens with broods and gobblers as well. And so we measure this by looking at profile boards and looking at the amount of cover at different heights. And so we do this here by an observer, and we're looking at the amount of cover that is obscuring these blocks going up in height. And you can see how control conditions have some cover at ground level, but it's pretty open going up. However, following the early growing season fire, a lot of cover down low, and then it's very open going up, which is perfect conditions for hens. The hens like to be concealed, but they like to be able to see above the cover. And then, of course, with the fire, it has created nice open conditions at ground level such that the poults can walk about, not being precluded with dense vegetation. However, in the late growing season, you see here dense cover, relatively speaking, down at ground level, but more cover as you go up where fire intensity was less of those stems were top killed, and more visual obstruction remained. And so what that shows is having by burning during different times of the year, you can meet conditions for different biological needs, such as hens with poults differing from better cover for nesting or better cover for fawning. And so thereby we can see how burning at different times of the year is not necessarily better. One is necessarily better than the other, but both provide something beneficial. And by turning understory that is primarily woody into more herbaceous species, we are increasing the amount of forbs, which is increasing the amount of nutrition available to deer. Forbs are king with regard to nutrients, much greater than the brambles, shrubs, and tree species. So by encouraging more forb cover as opposed to grass and woody cover, that's really helping to provide increased nutrition, not only for deer, not only for turkeys, but think also about the insects that are associated with the forbs as opposed to grasses and woody species. So that's very important for the turkey poults and other birds as well. Certainly for lactating does such as this. As I mentioned, this is good for other species, and here's a study that we conducted up on the Cumberland Plateau, looking at the effect of woodland restoration on songbird species. Noticed a negative effect on only 3 species, hooded warbler, worm-eating warbler, and ovenbird, but all others remain consistent or increased with the lower basal area and the increased herbaceous cover. So let's talk for a second about what scale of fire should be used. Now, I know with the state and federal agencies, you've got tremendous acreage, and of course, to get very much done, you've got to burn and increase acreages, and that's good. In most situations, you're looking at ecosystem management rather than managing specifically for one or more focal species. But that's not always the case with private landowners. And something I hear that number one, I champion this greatly, and that is to get more acres burned because we can have a much better influence that way. But let's think about how we are defining our success. Is that just by increasing the acres burned? What was the objective? And what I stress people to do is think more about why are you burning and measuring that impact rather than just reporting how many acres were burned. Of course, it is good to burn more from what we're able to do now, but think about how you can measure and qualify and quantify the effect towards your objective, whatever that was. I think that is very important, especially with regard to a public message for the reasoning behind burning more acreage. Of course, landscape burning creates a mosaic with places not burned, which is very important, and other places that barely burned, and some places that burn hotter. But typically, we're going to be concentrating most burning on exposed aspects, although other slopes can be burned as well. But another thing is to distribute burning across a management area temporally over time, and not just concentrating all the burning in one area, but moving this around to provide these resources over a larger area, I think is very important. And so I want to give you a couple of examples of woodland restoration in Tennessee and close with a case study. So here's Kiker Bottoms Wildlife Refuge. It's about 500 acres in East Tennessee. It's actually a waterfowl refuge, but the uplands are managed primarily for bobwhite. So all of the forested acreage that was on the WMA several years ago was removed or thinned to savanna or woodland conditions. And by doing so, this is the structure that has been created. Of course, we're seeing woodcock nest. We're seeing lots of non-game songbirds coming in. Here's a picture during the summertime. Bobwhite are in here in a big way. And on this area, the manager has managed to maintain a bird per 2 to 4 acres. It varies a little bit from the surveys that we do each year, but it's the highest density of bobwhite anywhere in East Tennessee. He's done a very good job. On only 500 acres, a majority of which is in wetland units. And so here, this is where we have had bobwhites radio telemetered. And in this area right here, and in this area right here, these are both woodland restoration efforts. And you can see how bobwhite have been concentrated in these areas. Here's another one. This is in the foothills in the southern Appalachians. This is a 10,000 acre management area that was all closed canopied until a few years ago, when they decided to remove most of the hardwoods and start encouraging the shortleaf and to create more of a shortleaf woodland in this area, over about 800 of 6,800 acres. And this effort was implemented in 2017 to 20. And so what I did was go back, and we noticed the species occurrence, and especially some of these woodland obligates now are in there in a big way. But I went back and looked at the harvest records. Of course, this is open to hunting. And so in the 3 years prior versus the last 3 years of the implementation, deer harvest went up 250%, turkey harvest went up 445%, and bear harvest went up 680% after implementing this management on these 800 acres. So this is a real impact. And things such as this provide that information that I think can be very encouraging for landowners. So I'll close with this, and this is a case study. And of all places, believe it or not, this is on a Girl Scouts camp. And I've worked with them for 20 plus years, and with lots of different things on managing the property. It's a 550 acre property. Well, in 2002 and 2003, the pine beetle came through and killed most of the Virginia and shortleaf pine that were in this stand that was mixed pine and hardwood. And that's a picture of it right here. And I took this picture in April of 2006. And this stand is about 25 acres. And we burned it in April of 2004, a couple of years after the pine beetles came through. However, we then decided we want to restore this site more as a woodland. And so we started removing by either felling or girdling and spraying specific trees, leaving the ones that we wanted, and began burning the site more quickly. And so here is where we burned in April of 2007. Here is in September of 2008, and that was the first late growing season fire on this site. Here we burned in August of 2010. You can see how the structure is really beginning to change. We burned again in September of 2011. Here's a picture of the site in July of 2012. That's a measured 1,400 pounds of deer forage, selected deer forage per acre. We burned again in April of 2013. Here it is in June of 2013. And we do plant sampling in this stand each year. And so in 2008, we see that tree sprouts represented 49%, about half, of the ground cover in this area. And forbs represented only 5%. This is very, very common, and all of you have seen it when you've thinned an area and you begin doing some prescribed burning. And of course, that is following 2 April fires. Here it is in 2009, following the 2 April fires and 1 September fire. Now we're down to 34% relative coverage of trees in the understory and up to 25% forbs after that 1 September fire. Now, after the 2nd September fire in September 2011, we do the vegetation survey in 2012. Now we're down to 19% tree coverage, 26% forb coverage. Following another April fire in 2013, as I showed, look at the relatively even distribution of plant types that we have in the understory. Fast forward, we're seeing all of the woodland obligates coming into the stand in abundance. We burned again in March of 2016. Here it is in September of 2017. Good structure for deer in here. In July of 2018, a couple things I want you to check out or notice. Notice how, number one, this area is relatively open, you know, from the camera view versus kind of behind me here, it's less open, more trees. And you also see some standing dead trees. Well, none of these dead trees are dead because of fire. All of them are dead because of my chainsaw and a squirt bottle. And so, as I mentioned in that one slide, this is a process. It's not just an event. You know, we continue to come in and work in these stands. Trees continue to grow. Other trees continue to come in, escape the fire, and come into the stand. And so we're continually working with this to keep this condition going. And so this mosaic of more open areas and more closed areas is something that we refer to as variable retention. And in these more dense areas, as you see right here, this is where we're more apt to see turkey nests, for example. And then if I turn about 90 degrees to my right, this is what I'm looking at. This is more open. This is more open in here because we left more trees. We left more trees here because they were all desirable species. When I turned back around where it was more, had fewer tree species left, that was because we didn't like those. And so we have patches within the stand that are more open, patches that are more closed. And so that mosaic of conditions then allows different wildlife species, more habitat requirements or features that meet their habitat needs through the year, and different species as well. And here we see great areas where there's more shade. The vegetation is a little lower, but certainly providing good cover for poults. Better areas for them to go through, but yet nesting cover is still provided there, fawning cover provided there, more food from more of these herbaceous species provided there, and all the while in the overstory, we see these woodland obligate songbirds as well as the other forest songbirds that you would expect in this condition. Here we burned in April of 20, in August of 20, now we've burned this site 8 times since 2004, low intensity fire, altering our season of burning. Now look at the relative composition in the understory. 50% forbs, 8% tree cover. Don't let the 8% fool you. There's a lot of sprouting trees through there, and I need to add this to this slide. But think about this. In such a situation, you're never going to have solid herbaceous coverage unless, for example, you burn every year consistently, because you're leaving trees that are throwing their fruit and seed onto the site every year. And so what we're doing is creating a perfect regenerating ground for acorns and other fruit. And so oak seedlings are all throughout this stand because acorns continue to fall pretty much every year. And so they're continuing to resprout, but because they're doing so, we have this explosion of herbaceous material underneath. And so that's a perfect illustration of how that frequent fire is needed. Now, we're looking at 1,200 pounds of deer forage here. And if I walk right back over here about 300 yards into this adjacent stand that has not been thinned or no canopy removal, and I compare this to a food plot on the property, there's 1,800 pounds of ladino clover, red clover, chicory, very comparable to what is available here in this woodland. And in these woods right over here, about 300 yards, as I mentioned, if I go over there, right here we have 48 trees per acre, coincidentally about 48% sunlight that we measure with septometers, 50 square foot of basal area. Here's the adjacent stand, 118 trees per acre, 128 square feet of basal area, only 3% sunlight, very, very common to have 2 to 5% sunlight in a closed canopy condition, only 40 pounds of deer forage. Now, we burned this site right here 6 times since 2004 with low intensity fire. Those white trunk trees, sugar maple, American beech. With low intensity fire, we're consuming the leaf litter, we're top killing the small stems, but we're still retaining even sugar maple and American beech, 2 of the species that are the least fire resistant as you could ask for. So you see the effect of having what low intensity fire can do. So in conclusion, if I had to choose one vegetation type that would provide as many resources for as many wildlife species as I could possibly think of, and one that is getting a lot of attention today, the wild turkey, this is it. There is something in these stands for wild turkeys year-round. Nesting cover, brooding cover, loafing areas, roosting cover, hard mast, soft mast, insects, and you will see greater species diversity in here than in any of the closed canopy stands. I'm not saying we shouldn't have closed canopy stands. Of course we should. But what I'm saying is these open oak and open pine woodlands provide a lot for a lot of different wildlife species. And I think it's probably our greatest opportunity to diversify the properties that we're working on as anything else that we could do. So if there are questions, I'm more than happy to try and answer them. And if you would like to discuss anything, of course, I'll be here through the break and more than happy to talk about anything that y'all would like to.
We got a mic coming your way.
I'm like a lot of people, I'm here for wildlife, trying to reestablish turkeys on the hunting property out of these. 2 questions. One, how do you deal with landowners that are out of state that have no idea what we're doing here, or trying to really promote as far as the prescribed fires? And what can we get away with on the power lines? I've got about 26 acres of the hunting property on power lines. And from what you're telling me, in my vision, I'd like to section it off into maybe about 4 quadrants and burn different places at different times. Is that the information? Am I understanding you correctly, that would be probably the best way to try to reestablish or the understructure for turkey and deer?
With regard to the out-of-state hunters, I really don't know what to tell you. Are they coming onto your property or hunting around you? Oh, well, that doesn't make sense, because if he's from Tennessee, he should know exactly what to do there with regard to turkeys. No, in all honesty, you just have to work with them like you would anybody else. And in my opinion, start small, show them the results, show them the impact, and try to get them on board. I mean, that's about all we can do. With regard to the power lines, I would be surprised if they would allow you to burn under the power lines. There's very few instances where the power companies will allow prescribed fire under the power lines. If they will allow it, certainly you could maintain early successional vegetation. I'm assuming that this is obviously an open area under the power line. That would be beneficial for turkeys. But you may have to resort to mechanical disturbance and chemical disturbance through herbicides to maintain a plant community that's desirable for turkeys. And I'll just mention this real quickly. You know, we've been involved with a Tennessee turkey study for 8 years, and I could be here all day talking about that. But with regard to brood cover, everybody thinks of fields as being, you know, the obvious brood cover. That's highly dependent of thousands and thousands of locations on broods that we have collected. Less than 15% were in fields. And when I go to those sites, which involve 382 landowners and 3 WMAs, and I look at the areas where the broods are using, it's not at all surprising that the broods are not using the fields, because they're dog hair thick with dense grass and thatch at ground level, and the poults simply can't navigate through those sites. And so then they are relegated to using the edges of the openings, which then makes some people think, oh, well, turkeys like to use edges. Well, it's not that they like to use edges, it's that in many cases they have to use edges because the poults can't get through the middle of this. And also in some of these fields, what does it feel like typically on June 20th at 2 o'clock in the afternoon in the middle of a field? Would you want to be sitting out there in the middle of a field, you know, at 94 degrees? No. And so shade is a critical component to the thermoregulation of these and other species. That's where this comes in. This should be some of the most primo brood cover that you can have by allowing that, you know, 30 to 40, 50% sunlight maybe, but at least 20, that 20 to 40% range to establish better growth in the understory, but it's not so thick and dense to preclude movement, and it's not growing so high that it would if you had more than 50% sunlight to provide too much visual obstruction for the hens. And so by working in these areas, it can alleviate some of the work that you might have to do in the openings.
Part of the question, it leads into, this person is only keeping this land for timber value in the future. And there's not been a fire or anything, and there's very little sunlight. It's probably less than 10% sunlight to the ground. There's not been anything there for at least 25 years. And a lot of the pictures you show up here of basically the biological desert, the closed canopy forest, is what I'm dealing with. So the only thing I can actually control much of is the power lines. That's why I was asking, just trying to educate her on the benefits of doing the burns in there and trying to get rid of some of these sweet gums.
I would encourage you to involve the assistance of some of the folks in here with the wildlife and the forestry agencies to help provide, you know, educational benefit to her and help her see the value in some of the forest management that could be done.
We have time for just one more question.
Okay, I've got kind of a double question on this. Two kind of quick different things. One thing is, how about with that burning, and we were talking about turkeys, that coincided with burning and nesting habitat.
Yeah.
Avoiding that, because I know I saw you did some April burns. And then second, just with burning in the hardwoods when it's thin, what is your experience of seeing much butt rot before that were burning?
First off, with the butt rot, we're not seeing that with the low intensity fires, but when you start increasing the intensity to start damaging some of those stems, of course, then you can see that. There's no doubt about that. With regard to a good question on turkey nesting and fire and early growing season fire. Lots of studies have been conducted looking at the effect of fire on turkey nesting, and I've been associated with some of those. An interesting one at Fort Bragg showed that fire did not affect nesting. You know, very like maybe, I can't remember the exact number, 5 or 6% of the nest were impacted by the fire. So certainly not a population effect. But when you look at the effect of the fire regime being done during the nesting or soon after, and the frequent fire, the conditions in the pine stands there provided very, very little cover for turkeys nesting, and the vast majority of the turkey nests were placed in the drains. And so the fire regime caused the turkeys to have much less area for nesting than it would have if it had been changed. Now, with regard to general use of fire and turkey nesting, the main thing is if you're managing a property and turkeys are your primary objective, I'm not wanting to do very much of my burning, and especially not large scale burning during the nesting time. I can have a very positive effect by burning just prior to or waiting until after the nesting season to do much of my burning. But that being said, don't expect to have problems with abundance or population level effects for sure by implementing a few relatively small scale fires during that April, May time period, if that's going to suit your objectives. But I would not recommend or promote large scale burning during the turkey nesting season on a property, especially where turkeys are the focus.
Some people that may not understand what you're referring to a large scale, can you kind of quantify that a little bit? Because some people might not understand the scale of your study.
Well, when you think about the biology of the animal and their average movements and core home range areas during different seasons, that's where you have to think about your scale of management. And that is a question, in my opinion, that is at the forefront of what many of us are trying to look at right now, and something that's very difficult to measure and quantify. So on average, if you're burning areas, for example, that are certainly larger than about 200 acres, you may see less use of the interior of that area, whether that be for turkeys or other species, than you would closer to the periphery because of the proximity to other resources that might be in an adjacent vegetation type or different management regime. And so on average, for most of the game species that we're managing for, deer and turkeys for sure, and I won't get into bobwhite, but it's absolutely true with bobwhite as well. On average, you're looking at what I would consider 10 to 50 acre management units. Instead of burning 100 acres, try to burn 250 acres, that are separated and distribute that across the property. So that's going to be very difficult for a lot of public lands managers, of course. And, you can do what you can do and you can't do what you can't do. But considering trying to lower your scale of management and do a better job of distributing it will help provide more food and cover resources that are needed during the course of the year for more species. I'm sorry, I can't tell you, you ought to burn on an 8 acre level, but going more towards that, let's say 10 to 50 acres, that's by and large, in general, going to be better than burning more, 1 to 500 acre units.
Thank you, Dr. Harper. Can I get a round of applause?